Hey guys, so today we're going to be moving away from the digestive and excretory system towards the immune system and the circulatory system, and we're going to start that new kind of section by talking about blood. Okay, so for this lesson about blood, we're going to be going over the different components of blood as well as the components of plasma. We're going to be talking about all the different types of blood cells. We're going to talk specifically about the structure and function of red blood cells. We're going to briefly go over some of the different types of white blood cells, though we will get into those more in the immune system lesson. We're also going to talk about how platelets function, and then we're briefly going to touch on different blood types. So blood is made up of a bunch of different components. About 55% of blood is plasma, which is just the fluid portion of blood, and the remaining 45% is blood cells. Those blood cells are all made in the bone marrow inside of your bones, and there are a bunch of different types of blood cells. Your hematocrit is how many of your blood cells are red blood cells. So your plasma, like I said, is the fluid portion of the blood. It is about 90% water, but it also contains dissolved glucose, vitamins, minerals, different gases, as well as some waste products and blood proteins. There are three different types of blood proteins. There are albumins, which help maintain osmotic pressure. So it essentially moves water into your capillaries via osmosis in order to lower the osmotic pressure of your capillaries, and it just kind of helps maintain your body fluid levels in general. Then there's the globulins, which are part of the immune system, which protects against different microbes that might try and harm your body. And then there's fibrinogens, which help with blood clotting, and we'll talk about them when we go over platelets. As far as blood cells go, there are three main types. There are the erythrocytes, which are also called red blood cells, the leukocytes, which are the white blood cells, and then the thrombocytes, which are also called platelets. You should know both the kind of scientific and common names for all of those. They are all made in the bone marrow. The bone marrow contains stem cells, which are undifferentiated cells, and then they can differentiate or kind of like specialize into these different types of blood cells. Okay, so these are some of the different types of blood cells. So inside your bone marrow, which is showing like a hip socket or something. So inside your bone marrow, you have all the stem cells, and then the stem cells can differentiate into all of these different types of cells. So they can either turn into the red blood cells, which is what's happening at the top here, or they can turn into platelets, which is happening at the bottom, or they can turn into one of a whole bunch of different types of white blood cells. So the erythrocyte, again, that is the red blood cell, and the main job of the red blood cell is to transport oxygen around your body. Some of the oxygen that you breathe in will diffuse and just kind of dissolve directly into the plasma, but the plasma can't hold very much dissolved oxygen. So the red blood cells allow significantly more oxygen to be transported around the body. The hemoglobin is the molecule within the red blood cell that actually holds onto the oxygen. Each red blood cell contains about 280 million hemoglobin molecules, and each hemoglobin is made up of a heme, which is an iron-containing pigment, and then the globin, which is the protein structure. Each hemoglobin has 4 heme groups. Again, each one of those hemes has an iron atom in the middle, and then each one of those heme groups can hold an oxygen. So each hemoglobin has 4 hemes. Each red blood cell has 280 million hemoglobins. So whatever like 280 million times 4 is, that's how many heme groups each red blood cell has. So that's why it's so good at carrying oxygen around. The red blood cells pick up oxygen at the capillaries of the lungs and then carry that through your blood vessels to the cells all over your body. So this is just kind of what this looks like. So this is half of a red blood cell. It's kind of cross-sectioned in half here. And if you zoom in at any spot, because there's 280 million hemoglobins. If you zoom in at any spot, you get this big purpley structure here, which is the hemoglobin. And then this hemoglobin is made up of 4 individual heme molecules. And yeah, if you kind of zoom in on that heme, you can see there's an iron in the very center of it. That iron is what holds onto the oxygen. Red blood cells are concave on both sides. So they're kind of like, if you like took a piece of like Play-Doh or something and like squished in at the middle. This does provide more surface area than a sphere would, which by having more surface area, it means again that it can hold more oxygen. Red blood cells live for only about 120 days, which isn't very long. Over 5 million are produced every single day, just through cellular reproduction, so like mitosis. And the reason that they live for such a short amount of time is that as the red blood cells age, their outer membrane, the cell membrane, becomes kind of brittle, and then the capillaries that these red blood cells are flowing through are very, very narrow. So the capillary is nice and tight. The red blood cell goes to kind of swim through it, and it hits the walls of the capillary and ruptures, essentially. Red blood cells are also enucleated as they mature, meaning that the nucleus is removed once they're kind of ready to go out from the bone marrow into the bloodstream. And so the red blood cells that are floating around in your blood don't have a nucleus. This is just because by taking that nucleus out, which is a very large organelle, it means that there's more room for hemoglobin and therefore more oxygen can be carried around. Red blood cells do develop from stem cells, just like all our blood cells do. The stem cells have a nuclei, but then, like I said, they lose that nuclei once they're going to leave the bone marrow, once they're mature. Men have about 1 billion more red blood cells per milliliter of blood than women do, which is why oxygen transport and gas exchange is much more efficient in men than in women. And then people living at higher altitudes where there's less atmospheric oxygen also have a higher number of red blood cells. It can be like up to almost twice as much as the average female. Okay, specialized white blood cells, which are actually found in the spleen and the liver, help to regulate the production of red blood cells. So these specialized white blood cells kind of circulate like through the spleen and liver, and as your blood is coming through the spleen and the liver, they're constantly like checking on the age of the red blood cells in the blood, just to kind of see, do we need to, are all the blood cells getting really old? Are they going to die soon? Does that mean we need to produce more? That kind of thing. They also remove certain waste molecules from the blood, and when red blood cells break down, the hemoglobin is released. The iron portion, which is at the center of those heme groups, is stored in the liver as well as the bone marrow and can actually be reused. So a lot of our hemoglobin molecules, the iron from them is kind of recycled every time you make new red blood cells. The rest of the heme is converted into bile pigments and ends up in your gallbladder. Anemia happens if a person does not have enough red blood cells or enough hemoglobin in their red blood cells, which means they have less oxygen being delivered to all of their cells. With less oxygen, it means less cellular respiration can happen, which means less ATP is being produced. And so people with anemia tend to be very tired, have very low energy levels. This can happen if the person's diet doesn't have enough iron, if the person is has been bleeding recently. So sometimes like after women have their period, they can get temporary anemia. There's also some disorders and diseases that can cause anemia. But usually the #1 cause is a diet that lacks iron. Okay, so that's it for our red blood cells. We're now going to move on to the leukocytes, which are our white blood cells. You do have way less white blood cells compared to red blood cells. White blood cells, unlike red blood cells, do have a nucleus. That's what makes it really easy to identify white blood cells if you're like looking at like a blood smear under a microscope. The leukocytes are the only ones that have nuclei. White blood cells, their main job is to help out with the immune system. There are two main categories of white blood cells. We have the granulocytes, named because they have little granules in their cytoplasm. So under the microscope, you see these little like dots in their cytoplasm, and then agranulocytes just have no granules in their cytoplasm. There are 4 types of granulocytes. We have the basophils, eosinophils, neutrophils, and mast cells. The basophils release histamine, which causes inflammation. So anytime you have an inflammatory response, that is because of the basophils. The eosinophils are responsible for killing parasites. The neutrophils engulf and digest microbes and then turn into pus. So if you ever have like a cut that gets infected and it's like a little pussy, that would be your neutrophils. Dead neutrophils are the pus. And then mast cells help maintain the blood-brain barrier, so protect you from brain infections. They also play a role in allergic reactions. And then the agranulocytes are also produced in the bone marrow, just like the granulocytes, but instead of then just leaving the bone marrow and going out into the blood, they head over to the lymph nodes, where they kind of finish up maturing and turning into these different types of agranulocytes. So we have the monocytes, which engulf and digest microbes. Monocytes turn into macrophages once they actually like are ready to eat something. They work very similarly to the neutrophils. Both neutrophils and the monocytes slash macrophages engulf and digest things. The only difference is that the neutrophils then also digest themselves and die, whereas the monocytes don't. And then we also have the lymphocytes, which include your B cells, your helper T cells, killer T cells, and natural killer cells. The B cells are the part of your immune system that creates antibodies. So it like is a very specific response to an infection. It is what you're trying to make in your body when you get a vaccine, is to create B cells to create antibodies against that disease. And with like COVID happening right now, you may have heard of like antibody tests as a way to test if someone had an infection. Not if they have an infection right now, that would just be like the stick it up your nose or stick it to the back of your throat one. But they can do a blood test and test for antibodies to see if a person used to have an infection and maybe they were asymptomatic and they didn't know that they had an infection. So that's an antibody test. The helper T cells are kind of like the quarterback of the immune system. They kind of coordinates everything that's happening, is calling all the shots. And then you have killer T cells and natural killer cells, which, as the name suggests, kill things. Essentially, if one of your cells is infected, it will kill that cell. And then, by the way, we are going to come back to all of this in a later lesson. I think it's the next lesson, actually. And, oh, I'm going the wrong way. Then we have the thrombocytes, which are also called your platelets. Similarly to red blood cells, they do not have a nucleus. However, they're not really an entire cell, if that makes sense. They're actually created when just like a small chunk of cytoplasm breaks off a larger cell called a megakaryocyte. So the megakaryocyte is found in the bone marrow. These little chunks of cytoplasm break off of it, and that is the platelet. So it's not like a red blood cell that had a nucleus and then the nucleus was removed. The platelets never had a nucleus. They were always just a hunk of cytoplasm. The platelets' main job is with clot formation. So if a blood vessel is cut or damaged in some way, then the cells of that blood vessel start to release a sticky substance. The platelets that are floating by in the bloodstream stick to that area and just kind of build up and form like a plug over the cut. And then the platelets also release a protein called thromboplastin. And then the thromboplastin works with calcium ions in the blood to convert the plasma protein prothrombin into thrombin. Remember, pro is just always like before thrombin, so we have prothrombin and then thrombin. The thrombin acts like an enzyme. It's going to convert fibrinogen into fibrin threads, and then the fibrin threads wrap around the damaged vessel and kind of hold everything together. This is something that you definitely want to happen. Like, you know, if you get a cut, you want it to clot and scab over so you don't just keep bleeding and bleeding. However, you can sometimes have a clot form inside the blood vessel and actually block the flow of that blood vessel. Sometimes you'll have a clot in like one area of your body and it'll break off and like float over to like your heart or your lungs or your brain. And that can cause things like heart attacks and strokes. Those type of clots are called thrombuses. An embolus is a clot that travels through the blood vessels and lodges in a vital organ, like your lungs, for example. But yeah, other than that, you know, clots are normally a good thing. If someone has hemophilia, you may have heard of hemophilia before. That is a disease where someone doesn't have enough platelets, their body doesn't produce platelets normally, and they can actually like bleed to death from a paper cut if they don't get medical attention because they just don't form cuts and it will just keep bleeding and bleeding and bleeding. Okay, blood types. There are a bunch of different blood types, but there are two main ways that we tend to type blood. One is with ABO groups and one is with something called the rhesus factor. The ABO groups is just based on the presence of either an A or B or both glycoproteins on the outside of a cell. So if someone has only glycoprotein A, then they're blood type B. If they have only glycoprotein B, they're blood type B. If they have both glycoproteins, then they are blood type AB. And if they have no or none of those glycoproteins, they're blood type O. And yeah, these are just, they're little markers on the outside of your red blood cell. They identify your red blood cell as something that belongs to you so that your immune system recognizes it as something that belongs to you and doesn't attack it. And then the rhesus factor works similarly. It is just a single marker that is sometimes present on people's red blood cells. The people who have the marker are Rh positive. If you don't have that marker, you're Rh negative. So when we're talking about a person's blood type, usually we just say whether they're A, B, O, or AB, and then a plus or minus to say if they have the Rh factor or not. So for example, you might be like AB negative, which means you have glycoprotein A, glycoprotein B, and you don't have your rhesus factor. It is really important to know someone's blood type if you're doing like a blood transfusion or something like that, because the blood from the donor can't conflict with the recipient's blood type. So they have to either have the exact same blood type or the donor has to just not have any markers that the recipient doesn't have. So for example, if I was B positive, and I actually have no idea what my blood type is, but if I was B positive, I could get blood from someone else who was B positive or someone who was B negative, because the negative sign just means that they don't have a marker there, so that's fine. Or I could get someone who's O positive, because again, O just means that they don't have those glycoproteins at all. Or someone who's O negative, because then they don't have any markers, whether it's ABO or Rh. So you just can't have a marker that the recipient doesn't have. If I was B positive, I could not get blood from someone who is A positive because they have an A marker and I don't. So if I'm getting blood, the donor cannot have a marker that I don't have, but I can have a marker that they don't have. So I can be like positive and they can be negative. The reason for that is if I get blood from someone and their blood has a marker that I don't have, my immune system will recognize that blood cell as foreign and it will attack that blood cell. So it'll trigger like an antibody response. The antibodies will stick to those red blood cells. It'll cause them to clump together and essentially form like clots in the capillaries. They'll prevent blood flow, and it can be deadly. It often is deadly. Okay, I'm going to switch over to my document cam now. Okay, so this is the first thing I want to go over, just to review that whole clot formation, the job of thrombocytes kind of thing. So the first thing that happens is your blood vessel is damaged. It is going to release a sticky substance. The platelets, also called thrombocytes, are going to stick to that sticky substance and form a plug. The platelets are also going to release thromboplastin. That thromboplastin causes prothrombin to be converted into thrombin. That thrombin is then going to cause fibrinogen to be converted into fibrin threads, and then the fibrin threads wrap around the blood vessel and that plug that was forming and cause the clot to form. Okay, the last thing I want to quickly review here are just kind of all these different types of blood cells. So we have the thrombocytes, also called your platelets, which help with clot formation. We have our erythrocytes, also called red blood cells, which carry the oxygen. And then we have the leukocytes, also called the white blood cells. There are two main categories of leukocytes, our granulocytes and our agranulocytes. The granulocytes are either the basophils, neutrophils, eosinophils, or mast cells. The basophils release histamine and are responsible for inflammation. The neutrophils engulf and digest things. They die and turn into pus. The eosinophils kill parasites, and the mast cells help with the blood-brain barrier and are responsible for allergies, as well as the basophils. The agranulocytes are the monocytes, which turn into macrophages and engulf and digest things. They don't die, by the way, unlike the neutrophils. And then the lymphocytes are the natural killer cells, your B cells, which release antibodies, your helper T cells, and your killer T cells. And in the next lesson, we are going to be going over all of these different types of leukocytes in more detail, which is why I haven't really bothered to describe these very much. We're going to get into that more in the next lesson. Okay, let me know if you have any questions.